obviously an exceptional lineup. I think it was one of the best, if not the best, we've ever had. And like I say, Jeff does an exceptional job. Cliff is like a band that's, kind of playing in the groove, where they played so much together that you always know you're going to get an A-class performance.
Yeah.
Phenomenal talk. Ranae, you knocked it out of the park. Even though your United lost your presentation, you're such a good public speaker and you have a good presence, and it was fantastic. Adam, all I can say is that, and I do this, and I'm not making fun of you. I do this out of love. You're like the Austin Powers of Bigfoot. When he came, I was waiting for like an XKE convertible to pull up with that on. We're here with the British flag coming out here. Adam, I heard nothing but good reviews, and I've been recommending Adam many times, and it just, the timing wasn't off. And this year he wasn't supposed to speak. He was coming on his own accord. And he wanted to be a vendor, he wanted to meet people here, everything like that. Well, then when Lauren canceled, because Lauren had a stroke, and it was he had it in Florida. He didn't know he had it until he got back into Maine. He thought he was going to recover quicker. And as we got closer, he's like, you know what? And I told him, I said, Lauren, don't worry if you cancel. Don't worry if you cancel, because I have someone all right in the wing. And so then I reached out to Adam. Hey, you want to? He was in Ohio doing something. I'm like, hey, you want to go to lunch? And he goes, I don't know, what are you doing in Ohio? You're looking for trees or something. Oh, seeing Gwen. I thought he was looking for big trees. You could have. It's his fault. And I apologize to Jeff, because Jeff always is typically a 90-minute slot, but for some reason everyone's like, you got to do a panel, and I do a panel, and I do the panel. We like the panel, so it ended up being that just blame them and things like that. But so Adam's basically, said I met him for lunch in what's that godforsaken town with the Walmart in it? Highland County, we'll just call it to keep it innocent. Yeah. I know, that's the point. Highland County and Hillsborough. Hillsborough is actually a very charming town. And it's funny because he's going, well, I'm going to be in Hillsborough. I'm like, dude, I was just there like a week before doing some forestry work down there. And so I think Gwen and I messaged real quick, and she's like, yeah, it's real cool, and I told her where I was. Oh, I know exactly where that is and everything. So we met, and I said, I'll tell you what, if you want to hook up, he's like, well, I said, I'll buy you lunch. Okay. And so which was no problem. So Dusty and I hooked up with him, and I, basically felled him out and everything, because I heard how mean and vicious he is and everything. You can just brutal, and it's obvious. Yes, he is, see? And and then of course I'm like, hey, this is what went down. Would you be willing to fill in? And thanks, to Loretta here for sponsoring him in and taking care of some of his expenses. And so he knocked it out of the park. I got to get all his books, which I didn't have any of those. I had the first one, but not those other three. So I got that to my collection. So fantastic job, Adam. And then of course Matt. Now Matt, I'm just being honest, so if your feelings are hurt, there's Kleenex over there. Matt is a fantastic speaker. Matt is missing his calling. I'm a salesman. I could walk into the Arab Republic and sell them oil from here. And if I had Matt as one of my sales force, he would do incredibly well. He's sales 101 all the way. And so that's, if any conference you go to, I know, even if you would do so well because you're so good at telling stories, and you're you have so much information packed in there from reading reports and data that there's no one that I know that has the wealth of information in his head. He's like that's how John Green was. John Green, you could ask him literally anything, and he quickly referenced the date, who was the witness, who interviewed him, who sucked, who didn't, and etc. And it's the same way. And Matt being the owner and founder of the BFRO, he revolutionized Bigfoot because of the BFRO. Even if you hate him, yes, there's a lot of people here that are probably ready to pull their gun, and that's why he has a bulletproof, shield in front of him. But the fact is, his organization brought in these reports, filtered through them, interviewed witnesses, and posted them in a public place. So back in the day when you would hear that, as your phone was strumming up and you found his site, what did you think? Oh my God, there's a sighting in Ohio? It's incredible. I know where that is, and so on. So because of him, you know, he revolutionized the internet and Bigfoot going hand in hand. And because of that, the popularity of Bigfoot, once the group here in Finding Bigfoot started, you know what? They did that on a whim. And I remember Cliff telling me, or Bobo, he said, we figure if we get our 2 seasons in, we're good, we're done. How many seasons did you guys last?
Seasons are kind of made up.
Yeah.
So it was 10 seasons, but it was 7.
And how many episodes?
100 episodes.
100 episodes, more than Gilligan's Island.
Yeah.
I mean, look at that. So, because of Matt, because of Finding Bigfoot, because of Jeff putting his academic reputation on the line, just like the late Grover Cranston, just like Dr. John Bindernagel did. I mean, Jeff put a lot on his side. I remember when he first, came into Ohio for Don Keating's event, and talking with Jeff, I mean, I'm like, wow, you definitely have a set of you-know-what. I mean, just to do that. But being a scientist, he knew there's just too much evidence out there to just turn your head and walk away from it. And because of Jeff, granted he's not one of the 4 horsemen, but he's going to be in the second wave, so you're going to have to name it something other than horseman, I guess. So, but you'll figure it out. But, Jeff, I mean, I've known you for a long time. And he used to have jet black hair too. And but the fact is that because of him and because of him speaking out, regardless of what his academic peers were saying, look what he's done. I mean, he's built kind of an empire in Idaho State University. So take it from there. So from here, what we're going to do is, who has any questions for these people? I mean, Matt has a question. Okay.
Actually, this is a real important question. I've been wanting to ask Jeff this about DNA studies. Let's consider the Sykes situation. We'll describe it as, here's a qualified DNA guy saying, please send us some samples that might be Sasquatch samples, and we're going to use the best resources of our highly qualified lab to look at these. How often, other than that situation, has that happened? Where you've had an academic, a qualified lab, etc., coming forward and asking you, because you're the guy they go to, how often does that occur? Or was that the only time that like a reputable academic institution said, yeah, we're going to throw some resources at this and take a look at potential Bigfoot samples?
Oh, wow, okay. Yeah, I addressed this question upstairs, and someone got an earful they weren't expecting. So hold on to your hat. Okay. All right, well, let's start. I won't go back any further than Brian Sykes, though. Brian Sykes, let's just say, I thought was the riding in on his white horse to save the day after a very disappointing string of events associated with Dr. Melvin Ketchum. And I had lunch with Brian Sykes down in Salt Lake. He was on a book tour. DNA USA was his latest book prior to the book devoted to Sasquatch and Yeti. And I was very enthusiastic for all the reasons you just kind of alluded to. I mean, the credentials, the history, and so forth. But knowing, as I did with familiarity, the sort of indiscriminate collection of samples in the field, what's the word I'm after? Not maliciously, but just innocently collecting. Hair persists in the environment for a long time. It doesn't break down very readily. And so just because, even if you have a very legitimate encounter, and then search the brush for hair and find some hair, doesn't mean it came from what you think you just encountered. It could be there from decades before, quite honestly. And so I told him, I said, hey, my experience has been that people have submitted hair samples to me for evaluation. 8, 9 times out of 10, they are readily attributable to other forms of wildlife. Just that's the rule. But every once in a while, there's one that fits what Henry Fehrenbach and I sort of settled on as the gold standard, the suite of characteristics that were suggestive of a non-human primate. And I said, so let me help you. Let me help you screen your samples, because you're telling me you've got a limited number, a limited resource which allows you a limited number of tests. And he said, no, we can't impose our presuppositions on what is or is not Sasquatch hair. Well, if you know, in all the best of all worlds, that would be fine attitude and stance to take if you had unlimited resources, unlimited time. And I said, but I guarantee you, if you throw the barn door open, the whole barnyard will come in. And so then this is what troubled me, though, is that I went ahead and screened, invited people to submit samples to be passed on through me if they held up muster. And there were about 10 or 11 samples that I looked at, and there were 3 that were excellent. They fit the gold standard, so I highlighted those. I informed these people. I submitted the samples. Used Dr. Sykes' mailers and everything. There was never acknowledgement of those samples in the study. There was never any mention of results of those studies. I conferred with other people who have submitted samples who never got results, never got acknowledgement. And so, but that unfortunately tells me, and I acknowledge, Dr. Sykes is not alive to defend himself or to respond to this allegation, but in my gut, my reaction is, if you submit the results of a study where every single sample that you've examined produces DNA, and every single sample has been accounted for with some some common form of wildlife, that's an extraordinarily different conclusion you're presenting than if you say, well, I had 96 samples and 85 of them were barnyard animals, but the remainder, the last 7 or 8 or whatever that number was, it's too late for me to do math here, but those we were unable to even extract DNA from. So they're unknowns. That's a very different conclusion. Then, especially if you would have taken the next step, looked at those that had yielded DNA and what was the morphology, and I offered that very likely they matched the gold standard, but they were eliminated for some reason. But they were eliminated from the study. That's intellectual dishonesty, to put a very fine point on it. So I was extremely disappointed, and I expressed that disappointment repeatedly. He never responded to it before. He was involved with other studies. I came out and visited several researchers, but he stopped any communication with me as a result, I guess, of that. So that's how that ended.
So 3 good samples you give him and crickets.
No acknowledgement whatsoever, because because in the past, the samples that we were confident had fit the profile, the morphologic profile. Invariably, there was no DNA, which we've attributed to the fact that one of the characteristics was an acellular medulla, that what you normally see as a dark band under the light microscope was missing, because that stacks those decomposed cells, and remnants of cells, not decomposed, but remnants of degraded cells were absent. And so in the hair shaft that we often had, you just had the keratin cortex, the protein cortex, no DNA or little DNA, because there's no cell nuclei or mitochondria that contain the nuclear or the genetic material. So unless you have an actively growing follicle or an attached skin tag from a hair that's been forcefully pulled from the skin, more often than not, no DNA was recovered. If DNA was, it was invariably identified as human. And the conclusion was that it was either contamination or simply a misapprehended human hair that was pulled about. I always suggested that the third possibility was that these two species under consideration are so closely related that the markers that would distinguish them are so rare and dispersed that you have to sequence a lot of DNA. Most of these studies were looking at just subsets of a single mitochondrial locus, the location or gene. And it just wasn't enough information to be able to say that what you have is different than human. Now there's a fourth, if you'll indulge me just for a second, this is a really exciting part, an interesting part. It may be going off in the weeds a little bit, but the fourth possibility now, you'll have to turn to, I encourage you to go to the Relic Hominoid Inquiry, the online journal I mentioned. And one of the most recent submitted papers is about mitochondrial introgression. Now the short version of this is simply, two species are in contact, there's rare incidents of hybridization. And so we have anecdotes of possible hybridization events between humans and Sasquatch.
Yeah.
Rare, but there are some anecdotes. And one in particular I'm very intimately familiar with because I was directly interviewing one of the members on one end of the story. There were two ends of the story because the woman left her home reservation and went into sequestration down in the Southwest. We were doing a production down in the Southwest and had lined up some interviewees. And during an off moment, I was talking with this Native American gentleman. He said, "What you need to do is go dig up some of these unmarked graves in the cemetery by the church, because there's a hybrid buried up there." I go, "What?" And he told this story. It was the exact story that had been shared with us, not us, but John Mindzinski, who was with us on this trip. John Mindzinski up in Wyoming by Mary Washiki, famous granddaughter, she's famous in her own right, but the granddaughter of the famous Chief Washiki of the Eastern Shoshone, telling about the abduction of a girl who then came back eventually pregnant, claiming she had been impregnated by the lost brother, a Sasquatch. Anyway, so the short of this is, here would be the scenario. What would happen? You'd have very rare hybridization events. A female child is produced, which is left with the Sasquatch somehow manages to mature and gives birth to offspring. And now, see, with mitochondria are inherited entirely from the mother. They're in the egg. The sperm only contributes nuclear genes to the new ovum. So all the cellular organelles, including the mitochondria, have their own little sets of DNA. That's all coming from the mother. And it's passed from mother to daughter to daughter to daughter. But it's passed to the sons too, but obviously they don't pass it on to any of their offspring. Okay, so in this scenario, you get a hybrid amongst the Sasquatch, which has mixed genes in the nucleus, but strictly human mitochondrial genes. And then when she has offspring, if she does, her nuclear genes are further diluted through back crossing into the population, but the mitochondrial genes remain human. Now, the author of this paper cites examples in the modern literature and studies of modern animal species where this has been documented, where the mitochondria of the, let's say, the invader, in this case, the invading genes, becomes prevalent in the new population. If that scenario has any potential, that would explain why every time we test, which is always the default test for a preliminary examination of DNA sample, if every time we test for mitochondrial genes for a sample thought to be from Sasquatch, it's going to come back human if this introgression has occurred extensively in the population. So this is a really interesting. So what it says we have to do is stop with the mitochondrial testing and start focusing on the nuclear genes completely. It's more expensive, and we got to have labs that will be willing to make the commitment and identify the financing and or find funders to follow through. The challenge, part of the challenge is these labs. My experience with the labs has been they're just not willing. Even if I offer them funding, they're not willing to undertake it because it's radioactive. And these labs, the competition, publish or perish principle, in academia, is so intense that they don't dare be distracted from their main research objectives, and so they won't. And they can't assign a graduate student or a postdoc to it because it's academic suicide to be involved. So anyway, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Jeff. very much. Yeah. Okay, who wants to field a question? Okay, right here, come on over then, because you have to say it in.
Do any of you use the DNA from water samples? I seen on a show, I don't know how much credibility you put in it, but they take samples from streams, and they can tell you everything that's ever drank out of the water.
Thank you.
It's called eDNA, that's what he's asking about. Anybody here do that yet?
Yeah, I haven't done it, but I've secured funding for testing, a grant from an office to you guys donor. And I'm also working with another lab on the East Coast to get protocols for collecting water, not running water, but water from still ponds, because there's one of my study sites, we had footprints going through the pond, and so it happened once, it happened again. And also from underneath footprints. Yeah, it's like the soil from underneath the footprints. It might be more important to collect that. So I've secured some funding, I'm just waiting for the right opportunity, because I only have enough of one test in this sort of manner. But there is a guy, Dr. Haskell Hart. He is actually developing some protocols for running water and other things. He's been interested in maybe, I've talked to him about a place near my home called Bull Run Watershed. It's totally off limits to people in general, but Sasquatches don't seem to care. They just go in there anyway. They're the ultimate anarchists, But we know they're in there. I've had retired water workers guys, from the city of Portland. See, Bull Run Watershed supplies the city of Portland with the water supply. So for national insecurity reasons, that's allowed in there. But I've had retired Portland Water Department guys write me emails and say, Cliff, it's a Bigfoot preserve. We see them in there, and we've seen them. And actually, Peter Byrne actually ran a project back in the early '90s. Henry Franzoni told me the story. He was involved in the Bigfoot research project at the time, where they were using cutting-edge technology of these game cameras that would actually beam out pictures as they take them. It's like now it's like $80 at Walmart, right? But back then it was a big deal, and so they signed papers with the water department and all this other stuff. And they did a 6-month project, and they said, we're only interested in the Bigfoot pictures. You can have all the other pictures of all the other wildlife. They said, sure. And then nothing happened. They didn't get any Bigfoot stuff. And when they went to downtown Portland to sign the paper saying, yeah, we pulled our gear out, and we're done, thanks a lot. On the way out the door, a woman sitting at a desk says, are you guys the Bigfoot guys? And Henry goes, well, yeah. You put the cameras in the wrong spot. And Henry's like, what? Yeah, you should have put it below the lower reservoir, but you put it in between the two. There, all this stuff happens below. It's like this common secret, But anyway, yeah. So I'm encouraging Dr. Hart to say, well, maybe that's the place, because even though we're not allowed in the watershed, it flows out on public land. Yeah. I'm steelhead fishing there. Like I'm allowed to be there. So we'll see. I hear $7,000, $8,000, something like that.
And the lower section is all about fish passions. So Cliff and I both live in the Pacific Northwest backyard, so I'm in the Seattle, let's say in the Portland area. And as I was working for NOAA, the Cedar River watershed is the water supply for the city of Seattle. Same story. While I'm doing the field work, I've never seen so many bears, elk, large megafauna. Personally, I've seen Bigfoot, but many of the employees there came up to me knowing that I was Bigfoot stories. Jeff, I just want to applaud you again for bringing that point up, because as you speak to environmental DNA and collecting it, technology is starting to catch up, right? And that's great. But unless we can really do a methodology and apply it correctly, we're wasting money. So until we address the issues that Jeff is talking about, we're going to be able to say, Cliff or these other people who want to do this. Because people want to start saying, hey, we have it, let's do it. We've got to think it through. So just take that into consideration. Potentially on the cusp of it, but not quite there yet.
Okay, who else has a question? Anyone over here has a question? Okay, hold on, watch it. Yeah, this killing machine is right here.
You're talking about like DNA and all that stuff. I'm just curious, like if the Joe Rogan, I don't know what it's called. There's like it's on YouTube, the Joe Rogan something, and there's that DNA. I guess he's like well known. I think it even said like he had like wrote 30 papers, literally a quote. I think that's what it says on there. I've seen it like 20 times. It's like 30 papers he's wrote like on these DNA stuff. on there, he like literally says that they have, like, it's a fact that they've got DNA that's like a human cross breeding DNA. I mean, that's what the guy says. I mean, I just kind of, like, I mean, you know what I'm talking about? Is that anything to do with kind of what you're talking about?
With the guy that interviewed, what was his name? Yeah, was his name Scott Carpenter?
Crippled kind of person, he says. Yeah, so it's that, I know who Scott Carpenter. I don't think it was Scott Carpenter, but any comments? Like any?
He would have to be talking about the Melba ketchup thing.
Okay.
Yeah, that Haskell Hart guy I just mentioned wrote a really nice book totally debunking a lot of the Melba ketchup study. Not all of it, he acknowledges that. Oh yeah, Dr. Haskell Hart is a chemist and he became interested in the subject. And he wrote a really wonderful book called The Sasquatch Genome Project, a Failed DNA Study. And you should check that one out. It's fantastic.
If you can write a book on that, then there's probably something to it.
We have a question back here. Come on up.
Do Bigfoots know what cameras are when they see them, and how do they evade game cams?
Charlie, answer that.
Oh, I love to.
And the mic down.
Well, animals can detect EMFs, right? Deer will avoid game cameras. Deer will look right into game camera. So if deer can do that, Bigfoot we think can do that too. A lot of people believe Bigfoots can see the IR from a game camera. There's studies and reports of them avoiding that, seeing the Bigfoot, so to speak, walk around it. I think the Erickson Project, when they studied some of that, and Matilda and some of the other ones came around, they would throw a stick where the food is, because they knew the camera was there. There's a lot of studies of that where they can maybe see the IR, they can see the camera, right? What else can they detect? Yeah.
Charlie, I just want to add to that because it's not just the Bigfoot. So with the orang pendek in Sumatra, near an area where Cliff and I have been, we very clearly saw it on a number of occasions. I've taken photographs because it habitually eats rattan. We saw tracks which were consistent with the prints that you've seen of the orang pendek moving around the other side of the game cameras, which is intensely frustrating to me, but we actually saw it walking around. It actually had avoided them. So, and I've seen that very, very clearly on several occasions. There's a wonderful wildlife photographer I've worked with called Jeremy Holland. He's found many, many new species all across. He's currently in Cambodia in the jungle there, and it used to drive him crazy. So there's consistency about this with other creatures of this type in different parts of the world. That's what I wanted to add.
Okay, who's ready for another question? Okay, Minion.
Just a little bit of follow-up. Could it also be the ozone or the batteries or even the smell of the plastic or the crude product itself?
Well, I mean, I'll just pass it over to Jeff. There's all sorts of explanations. I think the short answer is we don't know, in my opinion, other than what I've personally observed and can document. I can't tell you about ozone. I've not done a diagnosis of it, but there's certainly a certain level of sentience here, which is above my experience with other grey tapes, and I've seen them in the wild.
The only reason I mention that is because some animals can, like sharks, sense electric fields.
And you're right.
It escapes me at the moment, but there was a publication done on a study that specifically addressed the reactions of different animals to the deployment of game cameras. And, I mean, there's this great little video clip of this band of chimpanzees just zeroing right in on the camouflaged game camera and peering into the lens, and video. It's just, I mean, it didn't get past them that someone had put something in their backyard, essentially, in their front room, and they picked up on the difference.
Well, that's what Builder Davis was working on when he tried to.
Bill was working on a system that he was using those cameras that literally he would set up and cover a huge corridor, say sometimes a quarter-mile long, with a multitude of cameras that all they did was keep constantly taking photos, one after another, and he was developing a camera called the I Gotcha, and it was a camera that he actually had a patent on, and that it came to the point where he was going to get it manufactured in China, and he had a real low unit cost, and then all of a sudden, technology changed a little bit, and that whatever he was using, another company, of course, a Chinese company, saw it and undercut him and just stole his technology, and it kind of thwarted the whole thing. So he went to these cameras that just kept taking photos, and I can't remember what the name they were, but they'll take like 1 million photos in like a month, and you could just quickly go through it. If anything's in it, it'll stop at that spot and you'd see whatever it is. And he had no success, but his I Gotcha camera, the original one in Maryland, he caught, and I've seen the camera because it also shot video, he caught a creature. That's all it could be, because there was this church, and you guys probably heard his story with it. There was a church that he was, that these people were working on to refurb this church because it was like an old schoolhouse and they were turning it to a church. So all the volunteers would come out there and work on the church, banging on hammers, sawing away, cutting wood, and the kids would play while the parents were working out in the field out there. Well, a couple of the kids came in one day and says, hey, there's a big ape watching us. And this kept going on, and the people that would stay at night and work would say something would come up and bang on the side of the church, or they would see something peek in, because the windows weren't in the place. They just had the rough openings, and they were replacing the windows, but they hadn't done it yet. So Bill somehow found out about this and was invited down, and so he set up his I Gotcha. They kept saying it was coming up from this one corner to the church. So he set up the little I Gotcha on the one corner. I remember him, he messaged me the little short video clip where you see something come up and literally it does this. So let's just say that little diamond is the camera. It walks up to the church. It gets, all of a sudden, gets lit up a little bit by the camera because it had a little illuminator, and it immediately went like this, turned right around, went right back. But the funny thing is, when it was freaking huge, and you could see, because there was a part of the house that was sticking out like an awning, like from the roof, where its head was, and it had to be every bit of 9.5 to 10 feet tall. And the kids told the parents at the church that this creature, there was a giant gorilla, like giant, and it would stand there and watch them as they played out while the parents were working away. Well, I mean, the only thing Bill could think was all the hammering, all the sawing, all the nailing, knocking on wood, everything like that, just attracted to see what was going on, and maybe it was a place that was coming through because it was an old abandoned church or building that they were retrofitting again. So that might be, something of interest. Next question. Wait, not Ron, because he's BFRO. Oh, Henry. I'm going to get to you next. Okay. This is going to end quick.
This is a question for Charlie regarding Matilda. Bill Mons had said that Matilda looked like a Chewbacca mask. What is your interpretation?
I got my info from Matt, so Matt is better to address this. You told me what you thought about that, right, Matt?
I'll take the question.
Yeah, Matt told me the story a little bit about that, and you can address it.
I don't know, do people even know what he's talking about, the Matilda thing? I don't know. Okay. Well, I don't know, do we want to go there if it's not something people are even familiar with?
I think they want to hear it. This is an educated group.
Yeah.
Okay.
Henry's here.
And I'm trying to think, because it's a long story.
We'll do just a short.
I know, and I'm trying to think how to address that. I can tell you this. What's that? I can tell you this, Henry. I have reason to believe that Bill Mons is wrong about that. And one of the reasons is a Chewbacca was created to look like a Bigfoot. And if you see the early documentaries about how that character of Chewbacca was originally a reptilian figure, but this was the height of Bigfoot mania in the 70s, and they transformed it from what was going to be a reptilian giant sidekick into more of a Bigfoot figure with Bigfoot type feet, because that was all the rage back then, and they knew if they had that on the movie posters, with that Bigfoot mania going on, it would create a whole more aura. But you can see when they were showing the original artists the documentary about them, the creation of the Star Wars figures, on the table that they were working from were some books with Bigfoot sketches. And if you look at some of those old sketches like the road drawn, you see that kind of simian face. And you see that same kind of simian nose. And if you were going to imagine what a large primate would look like in the face, with those same kind of almost like chimpanzee dentition, and that kind of nose, you'd end up with kind of a Chewbacca thing. I think also, the photo that he used to compare with that part in Matilda, I'm wondering whether one of that is actually altered, because somehow there is no photo on the internet of that particular type of Chewbacca mask, and I've seen 20 different representations of Chewbacca masks. But I've never found another one of that one, and it might have been adjusted a little bit to make the nose look more similar to Matilda. But I can tell you this for myself, I was at the location. There really was a young Bigfoot coming up there, and they really did get some legit footage, including the pancake footage. So there really was one there. We had a scientist living there, and one walked up to her along with the other person, and this thing threw snow at her. And it was the Erickson project. They were going to turn it into a big film, but Erickson wanted more footage than what he had gotten together. But anyway, the similarity between, again, what a Chewbacca looks like, but still, if you look at them very closely, you can see this Matilda thing is obviously not a mask like that. The fur is completely different. And the only thing that's really similar is the fact that there's slight canine teeth and the shape of the nose. But that's what you would get from a megafauna ape adapted to this kind of climate. They calculated that, used heavily sketches of Bigfoots from witnesses back then to create Chewbacca. Chewbacca is the best representation of a Bigfoot in the costume world, so it shouldn't surprise you that there's some similarities. And legally, he said it was based on his cat or something else, because they couldn't say Chewbacca is a representation of a Bigfoot, because then the toy makers could make the same thing, and they wouldn't be able to copyright it and say, no, you can't make that, that's a Chewbacca character. No, it's just our representation of a Bigfoot. You did a representation of a Bigfoot, you can't stop us. It's like one toy maker makes a horse, you can't stop another one from making a horse. So if they say it's based on a Bigfoot, they lose control over a very valuable toy copyright. So no, it was based on my cat or my dog. No, it was a Bigfoot in the 70s. It looked just like one because that's what it was supposed to be.
Okay, I saw a hand. There was a nice, friendly Jim, not him, over there. This man, come on forward.
We were just recently watching a documentary about color and how certain animals survive by being seen, show that they're poisonous, other animals hide, they show to camouflage themselves. Other large mammals, like gorillas, bears, they're seen. We see them frequently every day, and they're not scared of being seen. Like you talk about the cameras, and gorillas go up and start swimming behind it. Why did the Bigfoot evolve to where their survival strategy is completely different, and to not be seen versus be seen and show their strength, and they're very strong and very fast, and we'd all be scared of them and they go on.
I'd like to address that.
Well, I'll say one thing. In a nutshell, it's because they get a bad reaction when they run into humans, and they kind of learn from that. They never get a friendly friendly reaction.
My background is studying bears, and actually predators. If you look at cougars, if you look at brown bears, even black bears, they have at a young phase of their life, they are prey themselves. Also, the prey have a tendency to want to blend in so that they can, the predator, so that they can get their prey. So I understand when you're talking about highly venomous animals are going to stand out, or animals are going to duplicate that, that physiology and that look. So the prey, but to say that bears and cougars don't blend in is inaccurate. I just want to set that straight.
I would just echo that. I think your characterization, with all due respect, is way off base. There's the best book on the natural history of bears, black bears in Idaho, it's entitled Ghosts of the Forest. And one of the colloquial names of have that ability, that cryptic tendency. And we're very visual in as far as movement. If something stands still and it has any kind of camouflage, natural camouflage, like a vertical Sasquatch that essentially is wearing a ghillie suit, it's like that closing scene in Harry and the Hendersons. I mean, they play up on it, but it's an accurate principle. You don't see Harry's family until each one of them in turn moves, and then suddenly it's like, oh, it's there all the time.
I've seen great apes in the wild. If you heard my talk, I talked about gorillas and the orangutans. So I've seen their behavior in the wild. What I would say is we don't exactly know how many gorillas there are in the lowland Congo, in the Kula Basin where I've been. That's because they do their very best to avoid people. I'm not saying they're invisible, they're certainly not. I have seen them, but they try extremely hard because what happens when they have an interaction with people? They get eaten. So, one of the when I first take people into the jungles, one of the first things they say to me is, well, there aren't any animals here. And I said, well, yes, there are, they just don't want to meet you. Yeah, a lot of them are nocturnal, but they don't want to meet you because you're the #1 predator here. So, in answer to your question, I think there's learned responses in different parts of the world based on my experiences with great apes. I understand your point, but I can tell you now, if I took you into the jungle, you would be extremely lucky to see an orang in Indonesia or a gorilla in the Congo. I've been there many times, and it's extremely rare occurrence because you are such a danger to them.
Thank you. Mike?
What about their sleep habits? Do they have a guard? Do they sleep 4 on, 4 off? I've heard that before. What do they know about that?
Again, going back to the Erickson project, Dr. Leela Hashik, I think you pronounce it Hashik, from Princeton, when she was there, they were frequently seeing a young one and an older one, and Dennis Foll from Colorado, from the VFRO, was going in there dealing with the cameras and stuff. He's told me something very interesting, which I haven't forgotten, and they were in one of these very rare situations where they would be even able to notice this. They said the habits were these things would seem to sleep for about 4 hours, and then they'd be awake for 4 hours, and then they'd sleep for 4 hours, and there was this on and off, like roughly 4-hour cycle. And I had never heard that before, but they were there for a couple of years, kind of paying attention to what was going on. So I put some credence in it. Leela was extremely, conservative in terms of making conclusions, but they observed that, and I had never heard anything else about anybody being in a position to observe what they thought were their sleep habits.
I think Tom Shea said something like that one of those meetings.
Okay. Real quick, just a little brief moment. I have an, how should I say it? I have something called the Ohio Bigfoot Hall of Fame, and people like Don Keating, John Green are in it, Bob Gimlin are in it, and I have a new inductee this year I'd like to announce, and for all the hard work that they've done in the field in Ohio and into the Bigfoot community and everything like that. And I know during COVID we didn't induct anyone like we usually do, and so I thought this would be a good year to induct someone, because we haven't done it in a while. And Don Keating was the original member in the Ohio Bigfoot Hall of Fame. There's a slew of different people that are in it, including Lauren Coleman, John Green, Robert W. Morgan, Tom Page, just to name a few. And I thought this would be a great opportunity to introduce someone for all their efforts they've done. So I'd like to introduce the newest addition to the Ohio Bigfoot Hall of Fame, Mr. Matt Moneymaker. Check it out. That is Matt Moneymaker. Show him. That's a caricature done by Erie Eric, and Matt is the leader and founder of the BFRO, and next year I'll be bringing the plaque out and you'll see Matt's name, and I'm going to list him under Ohio because when you first started spilling water in Coke, you were doing it in Ohio. So you said it right there. And but you know, this is a long time coming, and Matt is definitely part of the Ohio scene, the Ohio family. Even though he lives in California and everything like that, because he started his real delve into the Bigfoot phenomenon, you know, in this great state. So that's pretty awesome. So in the meantime, I have one other addition to the Ohio Bigfoot Hall of Fame, and this would be an out-of-state edition, so someone that isn't from Ohio. And this person, all I can say about this person is that he is the most compassionate, nicest, hardest working individual I've known in a long time. He's kind of a goofball in a way. He's super serious. He's very dedicated. He's just probably one of the most generous people I've ever known. He cares for a lot of people. He doesn't put up with BS, which I love. And he's just a great individual. And so like I say, we have our Ohio list, and then we have our nationwide list of the Ohio Bigfoot Hall of Fame. And I would like to introduce Mr. John Wilk from Massachusetts into the Ohio Hall of Fame. Appreciate everything you do, and you've been a big support of the event. And I know I've told this story about John. The first time the Squatchachusetts, what I call the van or whatever you want to call it, rolled into the OBC, I'm sitting there down in the vendor room, and someone comes up and says, "Do you know there's someone selling T-shirts upstairs?" And this is before we had any vendors upstairs. I'm like, "Really?" "Yeah, they're just sitting up there at the couch and they're pawning away everything like that." And so instead of saying, "Oh, I'm going to do something," I said, "Well, they're probably just a vendor. They probably couldn't just find a table." So here's me going up the stairs, and there's Wilk and McCullough sitting there with stacks of T-shirts on this table and selling them for, I don't know, $10, $15 a piece. And I go up to him, I said, "Hey, John," I said, "Hey, I'm Mark DeWitt, the organizer of the event. You don't have to get a vendor table." He's like, "Oh, I didn't know. We're just trying to make up the money that we spent driving all the way out here." And just the way he said it, and McCullough looked baked as they need a gap. McCullough looked baked as always, which was awesome. And I looked at them and I just said, "You know what? I can respect that answer," because when I said, "You drove all the way from Massachusetts," "We didn't stop." And it looked like they hadn't slept in days. And so I knew right away John was a good egg. And he always offers to help. He always offers to, help in any way he can, to give an extra effort. Like if I say, "Hey, John, I'm doing some talk for a bunch of kids. Can you send some Squatchachusetts here?" Usually you get a shirt or two. He sends you a whole freaking packet of stuff, stickers and everything like that. And like when we did the 2014 Yakima Bigfoot Roundup, John literally helped with all the graphics, financing a lot of it, did all this stuff to help that event go the extra level, and he never was asked, he just did it. And he's generous and he cares, and people like that are amazing. And to top it off, before I knew John, I never heard anything on Massachusetts Bigfoot. And when he's telling me, and him and McCullough and everyone telling me all these sightings, of course it's really Massachusetts, so it's about as big as Cleveland. And things like that. But I'll tell you what, I've gone and visited him multiple times and been on expeditions in the Berkshire Mountains. You do not know what you're missing until you go to Massachusetts. It is a frickin' beautiful state. No doubt there's Squatch there. I did a lot of hikes just when I was there the last time to do some of these older forest tracks. Everything was there for Bigfoot to be there. Tons of water, tons of everything. And most of the people are concentrated in the cities anyways. Plus, you get to go to the Big E when you're in town with John, which is great. Nothing's better than the Big E, the best statewide fair ever. But no, John has turned Massachusetts into from nothing to a powerhouse in the BFRO.
Oh, yeah.
You could know firsthand what he's done to there.
People want to go there. They want to go on trips there.
Exactly. So John, thank you so much. Matt, thank you so much. Welcome to the club. Thank you. Okay, next question is from Andy.
Hi guys. Cliff, I pitched this at you last year. I'm down here. All right. Many species we're fully aware of are facing depletion of population, right? Urbanization, habitat depletion, environmental, poisoning. And I'm concerned, I asked you this last year, I don't know if you recall your answer, that with Bigfoot, Sasquatch, large primates, even primates overall are facing depletion of population. Are we facing depletion of population of Bigfoot? And how concerned are we? Are we chasing something that may vanish before we fully get a full answer?
I don't think so. I don't think there's any danger necessarily them going extinct at this point. As Grover Krantz said, I'll paraphrase, I can't remember the exact words, but it's something like, there's no evidence of them going extinct, but we have precious little evidence to suggest otherwise. Essentially. Where there were reports 50, 80, 100 years ago, there are still reports. And they have such a low population to begin with, that, yeah, and I don't know, using Krantz's number, I'm assuming Dr. Grover Krantz knows a lot more about ecology than Cliff, the guy who plays 7-string jazz guitar, he suggests 100 bears for every one Bigfoot. It's like, okay, I'm gonna take his word on that. That seems reasonable-ish, and I don't know any better. So in Oregon, where I live, there's 30,000, 35,000 black bear. 300, 350 Bigfoot seem to make sense. I don't have a problem with that. But 300 is kind of the magic number with large animals, from what I understand, like cheetahs, for example. When the population drops below 300, they run into some genetic difficulties. But in Oregon, there's 300 of them. There's nothing stopping them from swimming the Columbia River to go to Washington, or to go to California for that matter, or Idaho. There's really no natural boundaries that are going to stop them. So all those genes are intermixing and whatnot. And you have to assume there's probably another 300 or maybe more, because the Olympic Peninsula is such an astonishing habitat. Maybe there's 400 or 500 of Sasquatches in Washington. In California, all the mountains are connected. That's how the bears get around, all the way from Big Sur, all the way down the coast to across the Tehachapi to the Sierras and up into all that stuff. So I don't think.
Anybody else out there have?
Oh, I think Jeff has some stuff to say about that, right? I'm guessing. So you're